Hello and welcome to today's webinar, FSC Core Labour Requirements, Technical Webinar. My name is Vicky Tran and I am the COC Manager at FSC International. I have spent almost a decade working within ethical and sustainable certification. Today we'll be looking at the following. The webinar is divided in two parts. First, the FSC Core Labour Requirements in the Chain of Custody Standard. We will be looking at each requirement and their intent in regards to implementation. Secondly, completing the self-assessment and demonstrating conformity. This webinar is aimed for COC certificate holders who will be implementing the FSC Core Labour Requirements within their operations. If you have not seen the introductory webinar, we recommend that you do watch it to understand the basics of the core labour requirements. A link to the introduction webinars are available on our website. Both are in English and Spanish. Starting off with a quick recap, in the Chain of Custody Standard, we have a comprehensive set of core labour requirements. The requirements consist of three elements: the FSC Core Labour Requirements, a policy statement, and a self-assessment. Another way to look at how all the elements work together is looking at the process. First, as a certificate holder, you shall develop your policy statements that contain the core labour requirements and implement the policies on the core labour requirements. Complete the self-assessment and submit it to your certification body. The auditor will verify the policy statements has been adopted and implemented. This is supported via the self-assessment. They will also verify that the policy statements are made available to stakeholders, and the auditor evaluates the self-assessment, uses it to guide the audit, and checks the evidence. For policy statements, FSC requires the organisation to have and implement policy statements that encompass the core labour requirements and make them available to stakeholders. Many organisations may already have implemented policies that cover the principles and practices of the core labour requirements. You do not need to create new or exclusive policies, but you can choose to update existing policy documents to incorporate the requirements. But what is this requirement asking for? Adopt means incorporating the core labour requirements into policy. For example, the company will not tolerate the use of child or forced labour, nor exploitation of children in any of its global operations and facilities. And demonstrating it is implemented means that management and staff are aware and informed of the policies. It also means you have updated pre-existing operations, procedures and systems, or create new ones, and are monitoring and enforcing the policies as needed. And of course, demonstrating that it is available to stakeholders. This could mean that the policies are available on your website, in your newsletter, or posted within the workplace, or available in the employee manual or code of conduct, or Lastly, send to stakeholders as requested. These are the core labour requirements. These are the umbrella clauses, and we will go through the sub-requirements in the next few slides. The requirements cover the following: the consideration of national law while at the same time fulfilling the objectives of the core labour requirements. Child labour, forced or compulsory labour, discrimination in employment and occupation, freedom of association, and the right to collective bargaining. Central to the FSC core labour requirements is their interplay with national law. Organisations shall give due consideration to the rights and obligations established by national law, while at the same time fulfilling the objectives of the requirements. The core labour requirements reflect the ILO conventions, which most countries have put into legislation and national law. Organisations based within these countries may find that they are already operating under the core labour requirements. However, the mere existence of national law or the ratification of the ILO conventions does not mean you automatically conform. However, it may be more straightforward for you to demonstrate conformity if your organisation is already complying with the law. There may be a government body or a public authority that monitors or enforces this law by carrying out inspections or issuing certificates or licenses. You can use these to demonstrate conformity to the core labour requirements. But what does due consideration mean? It means to give the matter all the thought it deserves, to think it through, analyze it, and decide if it requires further consideration. Let's launch our first poll. This is the first poll. You may want to pause the video to have a think about your response. The question is, if the national law is in my country already covers the FSC core labour requirements, I don't have to do anything, it means I automatically conform to the requirements. Or it depends on how my country enforces the law. This influences if I conform or not. And lastly, I still must demonstrate conformity to the FSC core labour requirements. And the correct answer is, I still must demonstrate conformity to the FSC core labour requirements. Regardless of your country's national laws cover the core labour requirements, you will need to demonstrate you conform. Regarding child labour, the organisation shall not employ workers below the age of 15 or below the minimum age as stated under national or local laws or regulations, whichever is higher. In countries where the national law or regulations permit the employment of persons between the ages of 13 to 15 years in light work, it should not interfere with their schooling or be harmful to their health or development. So what does light work mean? Light work refers to work which is not likely to be harmful to a child's health or development, and it does not impact their attendance at school, their participation in vocational education or training. Let's launch the second poll. If children occasionally assist their parents on the family farm or business, this is child labour. No children can work under any circumstance. Not child labour, as long as it is light work and does not interfere with the child's education, safety, and development. Or not considered child labour if the work is not hazardous or heavy. The correct answer is not child labour, as long as it is light work and does not interfere with the child's education, safety, and development. If children occasionally assist their parents or help within the family business, this is okay if it is light work and it is outside of school hours and does not interfere with their education, safety, health, and development. The schooling period in a country is a key element that determines the presence or absence of child labour. Looking at the next set of requirements, no person under the age of 18 is employed in hazardous or heavy work except for training within approved national laws and regulations. What do we mean by hazardous work in the context of child labour? This means any work which is likely to jeopardize a child's physical, mental, or moral health and should not be undertaken by anyone under the age of 18 years. Hazardous child labour is work in dangerous or unhealthy conditions that could result in a child being killed or injured, maimed, or made ill because of poor safety and health standards and working arrangements. It is also required that the organisation shall prohibit the worst forms of child labour. The worst form of child labour comprise of all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as the sale and trafficking of children, debt bondage, and children in armed conflict. The use, procurement, or offering of a child for sexual exploitation. The use, procuring, or offering of a child for illicit activities, in particular for the production and trafficking of drugs. And any hazardous work by its nature or circumstances is likely to harm the health and safety or morals of children. Now let's launch the third poll. Apprentices or trainees who are under the age of 18 years cannot be hired at all. This is child labour. Can be hired to learn the job skills for which they were employed as part of their training or education. Can be hired as long as there is no hazardous or heavy work. The correct answer is apprentices or trainees who are under 18 years of age can be hired to learn the job skills they were employed as part of their training or education. Apprentices or trainees who are under 18 years of age can be hired to learn the job skills they were employed as part of their training or education. They cannot carry out hazardous or heavy work except for training as part of their apprenticeship or traineeship within approved national laws or regulations. If there is a requirement for hazardous work as part of training on the job through an apprenticeship or traineeship, you can provide supporting documents. Regarding forced or compulsory labour, the organisation shall eliminate all forms of forced and compulsory labour. Forced or compulsory labour means work or service extracted from any person, including children, under the menace of any penalty and for which the person has not offered themselves voluntarily. The next requirement states that employment relationships are voluntary and based on mutual consent without the threat of a penalty. Voluntary refers to the worker's consent to enter into employment and their freedom to leave the employment at any time. The threat of penalty refers to any form of coercion, such as threats of violence, punishments such as the retention of identity documents, confinement, imprisonment, or non-payment of wages, and denouncing workers to immigration officials. Let's launch the fourth poll. Is prison labour allowed under the FSC core labour requirements? Tick all that apply. Absolutely not. It is not. It is forced labour. It depends on how it is administered and the legality of prison labour in the penal system and country. Yes, as long as it was entered into voluntarily and based on mutual consent without threats. The correct answers are: it depends on how it is administered and the legality of prison labour in the penal system and country. And yes, as long it is entered voluntarily and based on mutual consent without threats. With prison labour, we must take into consideration many factors. For example, if prison labour is allowed within the country and it is not state-mandated prison labour. If it is allowed, the prisoner must enter into employment voluntarily with mutual consent with the employer and they were not threatened, for example, with a long prison sentence if they do not carry out the labour. Now we move on to the last of the requirements for forced or compulsory labour. There is no evidence of any practices by the organisation indicative of forced or compulsory labour, which is not limited to the following listed on the screen. This means no bonded labour, or also known as debt bondage, when a person has entered slavery as a security against a loan or debt. No restriction on the mobility movement of workers, such as workers cannot leave the workplace after the end of the working day or period or shift. Moving on to discrimination in employment and occupation. The organisation shall ensure that there is no discrimination in employment and occupation, and employment and occupation practices are non-discriminatory. What do we mean by discrimination in this context? Discrimination includes any distinction, exclusion, or preference made based on race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, social origin, or sexual orientation, which has the effect of removing or impairing equal opportunity or treatment in employment or occupation, or such other distinction, exclusion, or preference which has the effect of nullifying or impairing equality of opportunity or treatment in employment or occupation. Discrimination in employment and occupation refers to practices that have the effect of placing certain individuals in a position of subordination or disadvantage in the labor market or the workplace because of their race, color, religion, sex, political orientation, or any other attribute which bears no relation to the job to be performed. But what do we mean by the term employment and occupation? This refers to a person's access to employment, vocational training, and the terms and condition of employment. Let's launch the fifth poll. Poll 5. A sawmill with 50 employees has an uneven distribution, 48 males, 2 females, and none of the employees has disabilities that are visible, and the workforce is not at all ethnically diverse. Is the sawmill in conformity with clauses 7.4 and 7.4.1? No, the workforce is not ethnically diverse and there is no gender parity, and it seems the company discriminates against hiring people with disabilities. Yes, it looks all good to me. It depends on a number of factors if they conform or not, and if they discriminate against applicants from diverse backgrounds, women or people with disabilities. The correct answer is it depends on the number of factors if they conform or not. If they discriminate against applicants from diverse backgrounds, women, or people with disabilities. We need to take into consideration the sector and industry. In certain sectors which have had traditionally male employees, women may not apply for those roles. However, if they did apply, the company will have to demonstrate that they did not directly or indirectly discriminate against these applicants. Organizations should make qualifications, skills, and experience the basis for the recruitment, placement, training, and advancement of their staff at all levels. Moving on to poll number 6. The core labour requirements cover the principle of non-discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. This includes equal remuneration for men and women who produce work of equal value. What does this mean? Choose all that apply. Equal pay for work of equal value means that rates and types of remuneration should be based not on an employee's sex. Or equal pay for work of equal value means men should be remunerated more regardless of performance. Or equal pay for work of equal value means work hard, play hard. Equal pay for work of equal value means remuneration should be based on an objective evaluation of the work performed. The correct answers are Equal pay for work of equal value means that rates and types of remuneration should be based not on an employee's sex. And equal pay for work of equal value means remuneration should be based on an objective evaluation of the work performed. The principle of equal pay for work of equal value means that rates and types of remuneration should be based not on an employee's sex, but the objective evaluation of the work performed. The principle of equality relates to all the elements of remuneration, including salary or ordinary wage and other basic fees and benefits, directly or indirectly paid, in money or in kind. Differences in remuneration between workers are not considered discriminatory where they exist due to inherent requirements or specifics of the job, due to length of employment, experience, technical expertise, and performance. Next, we will move on to freedom of association and effective right to collective bargaining. The requirements state that the organization shall respect freedom of association and the effective right to collective bargaining. And workers are able to establish or join worker organizations of their own choosing. Freedom of association means the right of workers and employers to form and join organizations of their own choosing and leave them voluntarily. Collective bargaining refers to a voluntary negotiation process between employers or employers' organizations and workers' organizations, with a view to regulate the terms and conditions of employment through collective agreements. What do we mean by workers' organizations? It is any organization of workers for furthering and defending the interests of workers. But it is important that the rules and guidance on the composition of workers' organizations vary from country to country, especially concerning those who are considered as rank and file members, as well as those who are deemed to have the power to hire and fire. Workers' organizations tend to separate between those who can hire and fire and those who cannot. Workers can choose to join or form a union or create a workers' representative group or committee without interference or intervention by their employer or management. Let's launch the 7th poll. Poll 7. Freedom of association means that workers must join a union regardless if they want to or not. No, only if they want to. Yes, it is compulsory. It is a core labour requirement. The correct answer is no, only if they want to. Workers can choose to join or form a union or create a workers' representative group or committee. However, if they do not want this, that is okay also. However, if they do, the organization must not interfere and allow for the facilitation of this process, such as allowing workers a private meeting room or allowing union representatives on site to speak to their members. It is important to keep in mind situations that exist where one can and cannot join a union based on the definition of essential services in a country context. Firefighting could be considered as essential or emergency services in some countries. In such situations where the laws indicated they can be exempted from joining unions. The next set of requirements states the organization respects the full freedom of workers' organizations to draw up their constitutions and rules, and respect the rights of workers to engage in lawful activities related to forming, joining, or assisting a workers' organization, or to refrain from doing the same, and will not discriminate or punish workers for exercising these rights. This means that management does not intervene or interfere in any way in the nomination, election, operation, and administration of workers' organizations, and respect workers' choice of forming or joining workers' organizations or not joining at all. This also means that organizations cannot discriminate against worker representatives and members of workers' organizations. These might include discrimination in the hiring, training, promotion, or firing of worker representatives or members. Let's launch poll number 8. What should certified organizations do if a trade union is not recognized within their country? Ignore the trade union, the law is the law. Respect the right of workers to organize to the full extent permitted by law. Or fire all workers who are members of the union. The correct answer is respect the right of workers to organize to the full extent permitted by law. The organization should allow for workers to organize in other forms, such as a workers' representative committee, or allow workers to find other ways to collectively express their concerns and have a dialogue with the organization or management, which at the same time consistent with national law. It is important to respect the freedom of association for all workers. The last group of requirements for freedom of association and effective right to collective bargaining. The organization negotiates with lawfully established workers' organizations and representatives in good faith and with the best efforts to reach a collective bargaining agreement. And the collective bargaining agreements are implemented. Good faith in negotiation refers to the organization as the employer and workers' organizations to make every effort to reach an agreement, conduct genuine and constructive negotiations, avoid unjustified delays in negotiations, respect agreements concluded, and give sufficient time to discuss and settle collective disputes. Examples of good faith in negotiation are providing workers with information to support collective bargaining, such as pay scales, complying with what was agreed, and not prolonging negotiations and making an effort to reach an agreement. Let's launch the 9th poll. What should organizations do if national law restricts workers' organizations? Give the freedom to workers to develop alternative mechanisms to protect their rights. Management intervenes and develop alternative mechanisms for workers. Reject alternative mechanisms as the only legitimate voice of workers is a trade union. The correct answer is give the freedom to workers to develop alternative mechanisms to protect their rights. In countries where it is not possible to establish free and independent trade unions because it is restricted under law, the organization should allow alternative options for workers to freely develop alternative mechanisms while respecting the law. For your information, all the polls and questions are included within the guidance document which will be released this year. Now we will move on to the second part of the webinar, where we will focus on the self-assessment and implementation of the core labour requirements. Just to recap, the self-assessment template was developed for certificate holders to describe how they apply the FSC core labour requirements to their operations, and it is submitted to their certification body, which guides the audit process and verification. Certificate holders are required to respond to a set of questions, such as identifying any legal obligations that they believe may impact their ability to comply, and gather evidence to demonstrate compliance and list them within the assessment. The simplest way to approach completing the self-assessment is by looking at three aspects. First, your country situation. Is there a law or legal obligations that may impact your ability to conform? Describe how you mitigate these limitations. Second, your organizational situation. Describe how and why your organization complies or does not comply with the requirements. And lastly, list the evidence that you will rely on to demonstrate conformity. Let's start with child labour. For your country situation, are there legal or regulatory restrictions that would limit your ability to comply with the requirement? Maybe there are laws which allow for workers from the age of 13 to 15 rather than 15 and above. Describe how you mitigate this limitation, then consider your organizational situation. Here are some questions to consider. These are only examples and it is not exhaustive, but they are meant to get you thinking about your organizational situation. Do you have a policy on child labour? Do you have an effective recruitment and hiring procedure, which include age verification? Do you keep copies of identification for all workers? If not copies, an age register? Then identify evidence that you will rely on to demonstrate conformity to the child labour requirements. These can be work contracts or agreements, including with recruitment agencies, employment policy and hiring procedures, age verification procedure for identification, employee records including seasonal and migrant workers, such as an age register, identity documents such as copies of birth certificates or national ID cards. Moving on to forced or compulsory labour. For your country situation, consider your legal or regulatory restrictions which will limit your ability to comply. Perhaps there is state-sponsored prison labor within your country. Describe how you mitigate this limitation. Then consider your organizational situation. Do you ensure that any wage advances or loans to workers are not tied to continued employment? Do you make sure workers do not pay any fees or deposits to commence or access employment within your organization? Do you allow workers to leave the workplace at the end of the working day and are free to move around the workplace within reason? Then identify evidence that you will rely on to demonstrate conformity regarding forced or compulsory labor. These can be pay records, which means that workers are paid. Records of Labor Inspectorate. If a public authority inspects workplaces in regards to forced or compulsory labor, you can use the report or certificate issued by this authority. Any employment contracts, which demonstrate that workers have entered voluntarily into employment and not against their will. Statutory deductions, such as Social Security, income tax, and other benefits, which demonstrates your workers are registered and are on your books. Dispute and grievance procedures and records demonstrate workers can freely submit complaints without threat or punishment. Moving on to discrimination within employment and occupation. Looking at your country situation, are there legal or regulatory restrictions that would limit your ability to comply with this requirement? Perhaps there is a law that allows for companies to pay migrant workers less. Describe how you mitigate this limitation. For example, even the law allows you to pay migrant workers less, but you pay all the workers the same rate, regardless if they are local or migrant workers. Then consider your organizational situation. Here are some questions to consider. Do you have policies about non-discrimination? Is your hiring process based on the skills and experience of the candidates? Do you ensure all employees have a fair opportunity for promotion according to their performance? Then identify evidence you will rely on to demonstrate conformity to the requirements, such as job adverts. Are they discriminatory or not? Job application records, equal opportunity policies, grievance or complaint procedures and records, to show that you take complaints and grievances on discrimination within employment and occupation seriously. Job evaluations or appraisals or performance assessments, or any positive discrimination or affirmative action programs. Lastly, we'll move on to freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. Looking at your country situation, are there any legal or regulatory restrictions that would limit your ability to comply? For example, in some countries where national law limits the trade union choice, preventing workers from organizing independently, describe how you mitigate this limitation. For example, you may allow for a parallel representation system with free elections of worker representatives or workers' committees at an organizational level while complying with the law. Then consider your organizational situation. Here are some questions to consider. Can your workers freely join workers' organisation, including trade unions of their choice, with no interference from your organisation? If workers are represented by a union, is the union autonomous or and independent? What forms of workers' representation other than unions exist at the site? Then identify evidence that you as an organisation will rely on to demonstrate conformity. These can be collective bargaining agreements, minutes or documents from meetings related to the development of the collective bargaining agreement, documented evidence and records of the workers' representatives' elections. Thank you for listening. If you want to stay up to date on our engagement activities in regards to the core labour requirements, please sign up to our newsletter at the FSC International website. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email us at chainofcustody@fsc.org. We will release a Q&A document over the coming weeks. Thank you.